But folks, we're going to go to post game in just a second. Patreon.com/leftreckoning. Don't forget that you can leave us a message at 1-940-289-7234. But before we do that, we have another bit about AOC. We talked about her earlier because she was one of the signatures on the
signatories.
Signatories. I'm trying not to use. That sounds like a French word?
It is a big word. Yeah. I know. I understand.
French word.
Signatory.
I don't know if it's French or not, but I want to talk about. I want to talk about this segment that sort of went viral the other day of AOC on CNN, because I think it really hits on, like, one, some things that we need to do, and two, how this, like, death cult around the courts, which I'm going to call a death cult at this point because it's literally killing people. When we talk about them taking away the rights to abortion. I mean, the horror stories that we've been hearing here in Texas and all across the country of people having serious medical complications or passing away because they don't have access to medical care because this anti-woman Supreme Court decision came out. I mean, like, this is as serious as it gets. And the way I think that there's an opening right now, I think, even with like a traditional Democratic Party voters on this, but then you can see like a certain group of them sort of shriveling up and defending the court. And AOC got a lot of flack for this, and I think that Left Reckoning is the program that should say she's right here. And we could play a couple minutes of this interview she had with Anderson Cooper on the Supreme Court. I'm not on the Supreme Court, on the judicial branch in general.
When you've heard the news this afternoon, a couple hours ago, what did you think?
Wait, sorry. And just so people are up to date, this is in response to a Texas judge banning abortion medicine, trying to overrule the FDA decision that this is safe for people to use.
I think rulings like this, and I think we've seen from the FDA and also from activity in Congress, that some of these rulings, I think we've been preparing and anticipating for there being these egregious overreaches by members of the judiciary appointed by a right-wing Republican Party whose goal for a very long time was to just pack these courts with partisan judges, often underqualified or completely unqualified for their role. And so there has been thought, I believe, given to this. Senator Ron Wyden has already issued statements, for example, advising what we should do in a situation like this, which I concur, which is that I believe that the Biden administration should ignore this ruling. I think that the courts have the legitimacy and they rely on the legitimacy of their rulings. And what they are currently doing is engaged in an unprecedented and dramatic erosion of the legitimacy of the courts. It is the justices themselves, through the deeply partisan and unfounded nature of these rulings, that are undermining their own enforcement.
So you're saying the Biden administration should ignore this court, but what does that look like? What does that actually mean?
I think the interesting thing when it comes to a ruling is that it relies on enforcement. And it is up to the Biden administration to choose whether or not to enforce such a ruling.
But do we want to live in a world where a government can decide to ignore a federal court ruling?
Well, no, of course. I mean, I do think that it raises these important questions. And I do think that when we look at, and there are serious questions that the FDA and the Biden administration is going to have to figure out, and how exactly we map this out. But on the other hand, what we are also seeing is a power grab over our courts, in which the laws passed by Congress and the rules and policies passed by the executive branch now are going to require unanimous consent from 650 district court judges, many of which are appointed with even, the American Bar Association saying that they're completely unfit for the role.
Yeah, get them the fuck out of here. Yeah. I mean, that's what's so refreshing about that is to be spoken to like an adult, like an adult citizen of a democratic republic, nominally speaking, not some infant that has to be shocked by everything because we don't have object permanence in the political realm yet. Like, we have to act surprised and shocked and aghast. No, This is bullshit, and we need to treat it like bullshit.
I think
There
it.
it is.
I think it absolutely is, and I want to talk more broadly about stuff going on contemporarily today, Matt. But like, so almost immediately, this comes out, and there's a freak out. Like, oh, even Anderson, right, is saying, "Oh my lord, what if we do this? What a slippery slope! The entire fabric of our democracy will fall apart if we don't let these unelected people as far away from democracy as possible be able to overrule and just make unilateral decisions on like how we govern and live." um it is an affront to democracy. It was designed to be an affront to democracy. It was designed to be, if anything, a check on the quote unquote like mob. And Anderson Cooper asked, like, do you want to live in a country where like the government, the legislative branch or the executive branch can just overrule the court? And you just, when I hear something like that, I'm like, well, do I want to live in a country where some fella in Texas can just decide that we're not going to be able to use basic medicine anymore? I don't. I think that's bad.
Ridiculous.
And so anyways, you get all this hand wringing, particularly from like the section of the Democratic Party that hates AOC and Bernie and like these kind of movements. So it's like, they're not serious. They don't understand the laws. They don't understand the system. Well, I'll just say this right quick. Thank God that those people back in the 1800s didn't have the ear of the government when people were making the same arguments about slavery. And let's just look at this historical precedent that we have here. Here's a nice picture of Abraham Lincoln, a hero of the left. And this is coming from a piece by Matt Karp, who we've had on the program, How Abraham Lincoln Fought the Supreme Court. In 1857, a Southern majority Supreme Court ruled in the Dred Scott v. Sanford that Scott had no legal right to bring suit in federal court. That in Chief Justice Roger B. Taney's famous words, colonial and U.S. history showed that Black Americans had no rights, which the white man was bound to respect. Equally inflammatory was the court's ruling that Congress had no constitutional right to ban slave property in the federal territories. This decision outlawed the national platform of the anti-slavery Republican Party, which was premised on blocking slavery's expansion to the West. Slaveholders and their allies, including Democratic President James Buchanan and the overwhelmingly Democratic U.S. Senate, embraced the decision as a final settlement of the slavery question. Taney had proclaimed Dred Scott, quote, the law of the land, and the ruling party and government agreed with him. Abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, meanwhile, condemned the decision as judicial incarnation of wolfishness. Yet they knew that the problem of pro-slavery Jewish jurisprudence could not be solved by anti-slavery jurisprudence alone. We can appeal from this hell-black judgment of the Supreme Court, said Douglas, to the court of common sense and common humanity. The remedy for Dred Scott did not reside in a lawyer's plea or a judge's opinion, but in mass political struggle. And I'll just say there, I agree with Douglas 100% in that case, and I think in general when it comes to the court. But let's look at how Lincoln and the Republicans dealt with the court. Across the late 1850s, Lincoln argued that the American people, not the Supreme Court, were the true arbiters of the Constitution, and that the only way to defeat the pro-slavery judiciary was through mass political struggle. And after Lincoln and Hamlin were elected in 1860, the new president's inaugural address articulated this view in the strongest language he ever used. This is Lincoln. If the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the instant they are made, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. I think that should be emblazoned. That should be, in all courts in the land, right? That is as simple as it gets.
Exactly. And that's true whether we had slavery or not. And the fact is that we did. So like, I have no problem tarring the Supreme Court as like a slavery rubber stamping institution, but that just as a matter of civics, we should not debase ourselves and abdicate that kind of power to judges, particularly judges selected by a political class that's already insulated from democratic pressure.
And let's look again, like these arguments that we're getting from people saying to AOC, saying that like, I don't think that a judge in Texas should be able to ban medicine, are very similar to things that Stephen Douglas was saying to Lincoln, quote, when they were in their famous debates, Douglas accused Lincoln's party of seeking, quote, to destroy public confidence in the highest judicial tribunal on earth. From that decision, there is no appeal this side of heaven. Yet Mr. Lincoln says he is going to reverse that decision. By what tribunal will he reverse it? Will he appeal to a mob? Right? Again, this is what the courts are at the end of the day.
Yep.
It's something to stand between like the people and rule, right? And you see it from the beginning of our founding documents. That's how all of these checks on popular will are always described. It's law and order versus the mob, the unruly masses, right? And look, as a socialist, I'm very happy to stand with the quote unquote mob and with the people over a bunch of fancy lads in gowns.
Just to remind people where the word mob comes from, it literally, like, from the 18th century, was short for mobile vulgus, which is like the vulgar movement of, like, sort of, the common people. Like, that's like that. It was like elites talking about that, and it's still used the same way today.
On the question of Jeffrey says, on the question of slavery, got to side with the mob on that one. I
mean,
agree.
the mob's pretty fucking undefeated, I got to tell you.
So what does Lincoln and the Republicans do? Because obviously you think the Supreme Court that they inherited was some nice little Supreme Court that was going to play ball with things like the Emancipation Proclamation and ending slavery in this country. Once in power, Lincoln and congressional Republicans reorganized the federal judiciary and packed the court, adding an additional justice. But more fundamentally, they simply ignored pro-slavery precedents established in the 1850s. In June 1862, for instance, Congress passed and Lincoln signed a bill banning slavery from the federal territories, a direct violation of the majority ruling in Dred Scott. The court meekly acquiesced, recognizing that its political power was long since broken. As a legal historian Charles Warren later lamented, Republicans' popular assault on the court crippled the institution for more than a decade. He wrote, during neither the Civil War nor the period of Reconstruction did the Supreme Court play anything like its due role of supervision, with the result that during the one period, the military powers of the president underwent undue expansion, and during the other, the legislative powers of Congress. The loss of confidence in the court was due not merely to the court's decision, but to the false and malignant criticisms and portrayals of the court, which were spread widely through the North by influential newspapers. Obviously, that person is against, things like Reconstruction and the equal rights in the radical period of Reconstruction in this country. But the point is here is that thank
those
God.
woke northern newspapers. Oh, sorry.
No, I mean, yeah, the woke northern newspapers, and thank God that the radical Republicans didn't listen to the course of their time and the course that is now echoed by folks today saying you can never touch the court, right? We have a system of checks and balances, but it's checks and balances when the court overrules democratic mandates, when the court bans very popular medical procedures, when the court wages war on people's basic civil liberties and rights. That's checks and balances. But when a member of the legislature says, hey, I think the courts have overstepped their mandate and overstepped their role, oh my Lord, the constitutional system is in crisis, right? I mean, it is absolutely insane. And if you look at the history of this country, we would be in a far worse society had people in power with the democratic mandate that the Republicans had at that period of time listen to those naysayers who said, don't touch the court, right? Because, we have to let them do whatever they want. Yeah, if they want to say black people aren't human, we have to respect that because these people have degrees and the mob can't make decisions about the future of this society, right? Fundamentally, these are questions about democracy. Fundamentally, I think that there is no greater threat to democratic rule. I'm not talking about the party. I'm talking about like the people having power in this country than the Supreme Court and just in fact, generally the entire judiciary at this point, right? I think that the whole reason you have elections, the whole reason that you put these things up to a vote, the whole reason that you trust people to make decisions is so we can make those decisions. Now,
there's your judges.
If I already, if you're already following the argument, fine. I think the historical precedent for this is very clear, actually, that thank God they took that position in the past. But if there are any more naysayers, I will just say this, right? Well, how do you protect against the tyranny of the majority to the minority, right? One, this is like one of the biggest lies in American history, right? That the court was somehow historically standing with the minority over the majority. That's just not true. You look at the entire the history of the Supreme Court is the history of it rubber stamping the most brutal aspects of American empire, right? Like, if you wanted to have, like, if the history of this court, for example, was like pushing back against slavery, was pushing back against FDR's internment camps and doing things like that, then maybe you'd have an argument. But that's not how it has functioned historically. And
no,
even
can I
things
just
like,
put a plug in on that point? Like Ian Millhiser, who is, he's not a leftist. He's like a liberal sort of, I don't know if Media Matters or Think Progress, I think is where he's from. But like run of the mill Democrat sort of writer. But his book, like Injustice, is the Supreme Court's history of comforting the comfortable and afflicting the afflicted. Like you say, like this is not controversial. That's the line on the Supreme Court.
And even things like that people like to look at, like Roe v. Wade, for example, like people act as if Roe v. Wade was something that sort of came out of the wisdom of the Supreme Court. No, Roe v. Wade happened because there were mass movements that were pushing and winning abortion rights all across this country, right? What that was the Supreme Court being pushed in a certain direction by the public. And if you look at the vast majority of, like, let's say, positive Supreme Court rulings on those kind of things, they didn't happen in a vacuum. They didn't come because the Supreme Court one day woke up and decided, all right, we're going to push for this, or we're going to push for that. They were in response to mass movements, just like when Lincoln and all of them were banning slavery in this country. The court realized it had lost the ability to rule in this way. And the Supreme Court now, I think, has the opinion that it can get away with this kind of stuff because, as you've seen, for the most part, for the Democratic Party, it's been silenced despite the mass unpopularity of some of the recent decisions of the Supreme Court, right? And just lastly, like, this is like the most like hot, pie in the sky talking, but like people are always like, well, if you don't have the courts, then like we can just like fall into tyranny. Well, I think if you look at the long history of the United States of America, you can see that believing that the court should have this power over democracy has not delivered the thing that you're asking for, right? And in fact, more often than not, has done the opposite. So yes, there is no guarantee in democracy that democracy will be a good one, or that democracy will deliver the results that we want, right? That's the tough thing about democracy. But what will prevent that from ever happening, actually being able to live in a democracy that delivers for people, that does good things for people, is if you have a system where unelected folks can sit on top of society outside of politics and sort of dictate and act without any repercussions for their actions. We are long overdue in this nation for a serious curtailing of the power and the overreach of the judiciary, something that happened early in this country, and they've basically been able to walk freely, except for in moments like what happened with maybe FDR, or except in moments that happened with Lincoln and the radical Republicans, right? So yeah, I think it's a fair point to make. But what I'm saying is that, like, it's a false safety to think that the Supreme Court is going to be acting in the interest of people. We have seen the historical legacy, the historical record is clear at this point. You have to put these things into the democracy. You have to fight those fights and win those fights. It's not, what I'm saying is that, like, it's not a guarantee that there won't ever be overreach from like a legislative body or the executive branch, right? But that's a fight we can have. Where in this system, you have people outside of politics who, for whatever reason, we're told we can't touch. That don't work. It doesn't work. And we're seeing it play out and the negative effects for millions of people right now.
Yeah, I mean, this is just a quirk of the like U.S. Constitution fundamentalism, which is judicial review. The court should not be able to tell a legislature and an executive branch, "Hey, you know that law you just voted on and passed, you being elected representatives of this republic, you couldn't have done that." Actually, like, no, that should not be allowed. And it, like the bar for that sort of thing, they should be able to review on like smaller things, but. And I'm just reading like one of the like sort of like like we mentioned the reasons of supposed virtues of judicial review. Further, judicial review also provides a powerful counter-majoritarian force, so that the one governmental branch whose personnel are not subject to the prevailing political climates or special interests. which like that's conflation of two things. One, we'll talk about in the post game.
We know about special interests. Yeah,
Harlan Crowe, who's bankrolling like Clarence Thomas and his wife and everybody else in the conservative movement. That's special interest. Harlan Crowe's folks have never gotten our perfect 1,000% batting average in front of Clarence Thomas. But like, I don't think we need any more checks on the fucking wills of the people. I think the people actually, like, relative to like say maybe the 60s, when you actually look at the public, you're like, like this is like, and I just to say I would have been for the people, like for part of the mob even then too. Americans' attitudes on all sorts of these things are way more progressive on all this stuff. So like, yeah, like it's time to get rid of that shit.
I'm going to say, two things. And I think that people should, recognize this. This is like a positive thing for our kind of movement. The American working class and the American public is probably amongst one of the more progressive globally when it comes to issues of identity, when it comes to a lot of these things, like really does like lead the way. So again, like also like, if you have fears of the people, then I don't think that you can call yourself a socialist.
Right.
But two, like the facts of the matter are that like the American public is like incredibly progressive across the board. I'm not saying it's perfect. I'm not saying there's things that like are not troubling. But like really we do have a population here that is incredibly progressive, and I think people should own that. Also, Seth makes a great point here too, doing a little cross country political analysis, that judicial review to the scope that America allows it is quite unique to America, and this is true. And this is another thing where it's important to recognize that Charles is making fun of the way I say recognize, but making fun of it's important to recognize that that like this is unique. Like this is not something that happens in other countries. You have this unelected group of elderly folks basically having a veto power over American democracy. This is a truly American experience, and it's one of those things. It's like, all of the slippery slope arguments that you get when you talk about weakening the power of the judiciary. It's like, okay, well, we're not on an island. There are other countries that don't have this power, and they don't devolve into the same kind of tyranny. And again, you can't make that argument in the goddamn American case. We had people like being owned by other people. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, tyranny.
Like,
thanks, courts.
What the fuck are you talking about?
And yeah, even the moment, like, it's funny, AOC mentioning like the enforcement. Somebody's got to enforce it. Well, what does that remind us from history? Andrew Jackson saying like, "Oh, you don't want me to dispossess Native Americans? Well, fucking, what are you going to do about it?" And that's exactly like, frankly, like that shows like even in the best case scenario when it should have been working, it doesn't. So it's a lie that it actually does that sort of like counter tyrannical force. So get it out of the fucking paint, because like, as we can see, we've run the experiment here, and like, except for a brief moment post Great Depression, this thing is trash, and there's fundamental reasons to expect it to continue so.
So what I'll say here is, like, I think that we've made the case well, and we've done this. And in fact, if people want more on this, like, we had Matt Karp on the program probably a year or so ago to talk about that very piece. So if you want a more in-depth look at the history there, you can watch that video. But like, why are we bringing this up? One, because there's public discourse around it, but two, I genuinely believe that there is an opening right now with folks. Even like MSNBC watchers, people we typically like tease on this program, they're furious about living under this kind of system. So seeing an AOC come out there on a public program on Anderson Cooper or whatever, making those points, I think is really good. And what we should be, what is the role of the left? What is the role of socialists? To keep hammering home those points and trying to, continue to like grow this fissure where more and more people are saying like, yeah, we probably should be weakening the power of judicial review, because that's the only way that it's going to break. Is if there's more and more demands, just like in the case of, Lincoln and the radical Republicans. Basically what happened is the courts knew they couldn't fuck with the people anymore, because the people were so clearly on one side. The government was so clearly on one side. The elected government was so clearly on one side. This is exactly the time for doing agitation, for doing political education, for tweeting, right? For doing all the things that people sometimes get mad about, the online left or whatever you want to call it, for is like only doing discourse, only doing that or that. This is literally the time where that can have a lot of effect, and continue doing that kind of work of saying, we can't allow this to continue anymore. I think there's more political openings than some people think on these issues, because like the abortion ruling, I think, really opened up the door for some very serious discussions on changing the way that our system is set up. And like, look, going back to Bernie, Green New Deal is going to get tied up in the courts. Medicare for All is going to get tied up in the courts. Everything that and we need to start doing that work to weaken those powers before that moment. So in the moment right now where we don't have a Bernie Sanders campaign to rally around, like, this is a very critical moment to actually start to open up those doors, so that when we do have a national movement that's able to come to power and deliver these kind of things, we've started to conquer the power of the courts over democracy.
Yeah, and I like your framing. Like, this is a time to it's to help us stand up taller on our 2 feet as citizens, and not be infantilized by people in robes that spent a whole bunch of
That's
time,
right, dude. It's
hitting the gavel.
infantilizing. It's
Yeah.
infantilizing to say you aren't responsible enough to have a democracy. Is basically what that argument boils down to, right?
Yep.
They use flowery language, but they're saying, we don't trust y'all to be in charge, and we need to have our representatives from Harvard or et cetera, to be there. So continue pushing, folks. That was good. And look, we'll criticize members of the squad when they do bad things, but today, I mean, that was
Good
great from
week.
AOC, and them all signing that letter saying that Assange should be, charging against Assange should be dropped. Great. So we'll celebrate those things when they happen. Folks, we're going to jump over to the post game. We'll put the links up on Patreon, and I usually try to post it on Discord as well. We'll be over there in about 10 minutes or so. Leave us a message at 1940-289-7234. Please consider, if you aren't already, becoming a patron. It really helps us grow. Matt and I have some, big ideas that we want to do, but we've been sort of sitting at the same place for a while. That sort of slowed us down a little bit. We really want to be expanding, maybe doing some more live interviews and things like that. So consider being a patron. If you don't want to become a patron, or you don't want to make that kind of long-term commitment, you can grab a hat or t-shirt. We have awesome Left Reckoning hats. We have our LR on the road shirt. All these good things you can get over there at leftreckoning.com/store. Appreciate all of y'all so much. Thank you so much, Paul, for coming on. Thank you, Chip, for coming on. Both of them for all the work that they do. And we'll be over in the post game in just a couple minutes. So come see us.
Peace.